Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peter Tankov, and I am a scientific director of the PARC Foundation at Louis Bachelier Institute. The PARC Foundation stands for Paris Agreement Research Commons, and this foundation has been recently created to host all activities of ELB related to sustainable and green finance. And today I have the pleasure of introducing this webinar dedicated to the publication of the Alignment Cookbook 2. The Alignment Cookbook 2 represents the first major phase of the CAPA project. CAPA, which stands for Consolidated Alignment Performance Analytics, is a project that is being developed by ELB in partnership with a scientific portfolio of EDHEC, and which is financed by ADEME. And the principal aim of CAPA project is to develop a methodology for consolidated alignment assessments of groups of financial institutions with assessing the alignment with low carbon pathways. Now, the Alignment Cookbook 2 is a follow-up and an extension of the Alignment Cookbook 1, which was published in 2020 and contained both a high-level methodological description of what is alignment assessment and a review of over around 15 different methodologies. The alignment assessment is a field that has remained very active since 2020. New concepts have appeared: target setting, transition plans, consolidated alignment, and so on. New reports and academic papers have been written. New methodologies have been developed. So there was clearly a need for Alignment Cookbook 2. And as you will see in the following presentations, the Alignment Cookbook 2 represents a zoom out, which aims to classify the different methods, and now there are over 50 of them that have been reviewed, and understand to which extent these methods fit together with the objective of consolidated alignment assessment of financial institutions and financial centers. Now, without further ado, I will pass the floor to the next speaker, who is Mathieu Garnero from ADEME. Just one comment: if you have questions, you can type them in the chat, and they will be asked to the speakers at the end of each presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Happy to be there with you today. Some few words of introduction. So I'm Mathieu Garnero, in charge of sustainable finance at ADEME. And as you may know, ADEME is the French Ecological Transition Agency. We have 5 missions: support and mobilize actors, such as financial actors and research, financing projects, sharing our expertise on ecological transition, doing prospective work, what would be a neutral economy, for example, and support research. ADEME is involved in sustainable finance since 2015, with a strong acceleration thanks to the EU funding of the Life Finance ClimAct program. And to be concrete, if I have 3 key achievements to share with you regarding our work on sustainable finance, we have mainly contributed to the mainstreaming of the concept of transition plan in the context of sustainable finance. So we have developed the ACT methodologies with 15 sectoral methodologies with an influence on CSRD and EFRAG work. We have done work on a planification strategy at sector level for highly emitting industrial sectors, such as steel, cement, chemical, and this has a large influence on the French strategy of public financing in the context of France 2030, France 2030, and discussion on abatement cost in industry. And third example, the building and assessment of transition plan at financial institution level with a change in the mindset, because we think that we think that financial institutions need to classify their counterparty between no significant impact counterparty, sustainable counterparty, transition-aligned counterparty, in progress, and non-transitioning counterparty. And currently, this has an influence on the most advanced framework, such as Defense, Climate Bond Initiative, and we hope to have an influence on a prudential transition plan like the EBA framework. Regarding research on sustainable finance, we provide grant about 2 million euros grant since 2019 with 14 different type of projects, and CAPA is one of the winning project of the 2022 edition. And more globally, we have a strong partnership with Institut Louis Bachelier and research chairs like Energy and Prosperity, Economy and Climate, and of course PARC. So we also do co-financing of 150 theses each year with a progress number in a sustainable finance thesis since the last years. So I will be very brief. Why is this work useful and necessary? The work that Peter has already introduced, because the transition is urgent and requires large investments, and it is all the more urgent as transformation of investment and capex precedes the transformation of the economy. And when we look at the turnover of the company, it is also crucial to have a global shift in financial flows, and therefore to identify from a macro point of view which companies and projects should be financed and which should be stopped. In fact, developing a consolidated methodology such as CAPA projects contribute to this vision, and we are delighted to have been able to help this project. And for us, it's a good complement to the analysis that we can provide it at company or financial institution level through the ACT methodology. So thank you again for this great job and this cookbook too. And I stop there and let the floor to the speakers to present this deep dive paper.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. So my name is Julie Raynaud, and I will present you with a quick tour of the topics discussed in the Alignment Cookbook 2, a research report written by the Institut Louis Bachelier in partnership with EDHEC and co-financed by ADEME and Climate Arc. So in 2020, the Institut Louis Bachelier published the first Alignment Cookbook, which focused on the design of portfolio alignment assessment methodologies with a specific focus on implied temperature rise indicators. Subsequent work, in particular from the portfolio alignment team, but also from the OECD and others, significantly contributed to research on design choices. They developed recommendations on how these methodologies should be designed in order to be relevant and decision useful. Since the publication of the first Alignment Cookbook, we have seen a multiplication of alignment methodologies used for and by the financial sector, as well as an enlargement of their focus and uses. Methodologies have been developed to assess the alignment of financial institutions as a whole, rather than just focusing on their portfolios. A number of portfolio alignment methodologies now integrate more than just portfolio emissions alignment. And finally, alignment methodologies are now being used beyond reporting purposes in the context of target setting and decision making. So, yes, all good. So for these reasons, we felt it was necessary to update the first Alignment Cookbook. Yet the second Alignment Cookbook is different from the first one. As Peter mentioned, it is a zoom out. Alignment discussions are much larger than portfolio alignment. Alignment assessments, transition plan design, target setting methodologies, and others, we wanted to take a step back and understand to the extent to which they all fit together. The specific purpose of the second Alignment Cookbook is therefore to develop a detailed classification framework of the methodologies that exist on the topic of alignment, show the articulation with one another, and identify current areas for further research. As Peter mentioned, you will also find in the report a detailed description of 50+ methodologies. Thank you very much to all the organizations that helped us build these reviews. Just as the first Alignment Cookbook, the second cookbook was written as a pedagogical guide rather than a report to read from the first to the last page. So on this slide, you can see the mapping we built, which also shows the scope of this report. We differentiate between 3 different levels: the financial institution level, the portfolio level, and the asset level. At portfolio level, we further distinguish between target setting and alignment assessments. So let's deep dive into each of these boxes. And let's start with what we call FI level transition plan alignment assessments. A growing body of voluntary and regulatory frameworks encourage or require financial institutions to develop transition strategies, devise transition plans, and disclose them. Most, if not all of these frameworks recommend or require that financial institutions take a high-level commitment and set specific time-bound decarbonization targets, back these with robust plans and strategies, embed them into organizational processes, monitor and disclose progress. But when deep diving into the specific guidelines, it becomes apparent that their detailed content differ, as well as their levels of prescriptiveness and space for interpretation. Work to drive convergence is underway. In the meantime, this current divergence led to the design of varying methodologies used by external stakeholders to hold financial institutions accountable. In other words, several FI transition plan alignment assessment methodologies have been devised for third parties to externally assess the quality of an FI approach to net zero. We are particularly interested in those methodologies because they consider that the alignment of a financial institution is more than the sum of the alignment of its portfolios and also encompasses its strategy and internal processes. These FI-level transition plan alignment assessment methodologies can be divided, in our view, in 2 broad families. Most of these methodologies evaluate financial institutions' alignment approach using qualitative data with tick box indicators, such as, has the financial institution set a portfolio decarbonization target that covers a significant share of its portfolio? But a small number of methodologies go further by also including quantitative assessments alongside qualitative assessments, for example, on the alignment of declared targets with low carbon trajectories. These include methodologies such as ACT Finance or the Transition Pathway Initiative banking framework. Let's take the example of a financial institution that claims to have a robust decarbonization target. The first set of methodology will attribute the highest rating on the decarbonization target criteria if the target is designed using certain rules, such as relevant perimeter, relevant scenario, relevant unit, and so on. The second set of methodology may find, however, that the target is not ambitious enough when compared to specific decarbonization pathways chosen by the reviewer, and therefore attribute a lower rating to this criteria, even if the target covers the relevant perimeter and so on. There are multiple areas for further research relating to FI-level transition plan alignment assessment methodologies. First, as I mentioned already, there is no convergence, yet work is underway on the specific criteria against which a financial institution's transition plan should be assessed and how. Second, we believe that in theory, assessing certain criteria using quantitative methods is best practice in order not to take FI declarations for granted. However, how can we assess quantitatively specific criteria using only external data and having limited access to portfolio composition? Let's now focus on portfolio level target setting methodologies. Here, we distinguish between 3 different buckets. The first one is that of emissions target. Emissions target focus primarily on the emissions associated with financial flows. They can be based on a range of metrics, such as absolute carbon footprint, carbon intensity of portfolios. They can apply at different level of aggregation, sector level, asset class level, portfolio level, and leverage different scenarios and pathways. Target setters first calculate the portfolio emissions footprint, then set the decarbonization rate based on the chosen scenarios and low decarbonization pathways. All net zero target setting protocols and standards include this type of target. The second type of target that we see is what we call alignment targets. Alignment targets relate to increasing the financial flows to financial assets and activities that exhibit predefined desirable attributes in relation to net zero and decreasing financial flows to others. So the target setter first needs to classify financial assets into alignment buckets, then assess the proportion of investments that go into each of these buckets, and then set how this proportion should evolve through time. This type of target include the SBTi portfolio coverage targets, the SBTi implied temperature rise target, as well as the net zero investment framework asset class level targets based on the proprietary maturity scale methodology. In practice, the characteristics taken into account may vary and be more or less sophisticated. The SBTi portfolio coverage target uses a restrictive view based on the presence of a validated science-based target, whereas others, such as the Net Zero Investment Framework, integrate a range of criteria to assess whether a financial asset can be classified as net zero, aligned, aligning, such as targets, of course, but also decarbonization plans, governance, and so on. Finally, the third bucket is that of financing targets. It's a specific alignment target that focus on seizing or decreasing fossil fuel finance and increasing financial flows to climate solutions. Recently, what we have observed is an increased emphasis on the second bucket, alignment targets. Alignment targets are increasingly described as a means to support and drive the wide range of financial institutions' transition strategies, whereas emissions targets are seen as an accountability mechanism to ensure that the reorientation of financial flows leads to the right level in terms of space and scale of emissions reduction. Consequently, alignment and emissions targets are complementary, at least in theory. In the short term, portfolio emissions could increase as financial institutions deploy transition finance strategies, such as investing in emissions-intensive financial assets that are transitioning. But over the medium to long run, emissions should mechanically decrease to a level near net zero by 2050. Yet, this is in theory. There are still a number of areas for further research. First, how do we ensure that the emissions target set by financial institutions using different methodologies, in particular different scenarios and budget sharing approaches, do not lead to an overshoot of the remaining carbon budget in the aggregate? Research is lacking in this area. Second, what attributes should be taken into account to ascertain the alignment status of financial assets and portfolios? Simple criteria, such as the presence of a validated science-based target, or multiple criteria, more complete but harder to implement and compare, such as taking into account targets, but also transition plans and governance. And then finally, how should financial institutions determine the pace at which financial flows should be increased towards the identified financial assets and activities for the remaining carbon budget to be respected? In other words, how do we link alignment targets to the physical reality of emissions and decarbonizations? It means that currently it is very hard for external stakeholders to compare alignment targets taken by financial institutions and assess whether they are sufficient in light of the decarbonization challenge. More work is needed in this area. We now focus on portfolio and asset level alignment assessments. Historically, portfolio and financial asset alignment assessment methodologies have been categorized either based on their focus, emissions-based, activity-based, or transition plan-based, or output metric, the binary metric, the divergence convergence metric, maturity scale metric, or the implies temperature rise score metrics. Prior research has highlighted the divergence in design choices and results that can arise. Vincent Boucher will present a model he developed to assess the extent to which different design choices can affect the final results in the second part of this webinar. Increasingly, alignment assessment results are used to support the reorientation of financial flows towards transitioning assets and to complement other indicators such as taxonomic shares in driving investment decisions. Emerging discussions on transition finance strategies differentiate between different types of assets necessary for the transition. Work is nascent and rapidly evolving in that field, as you can see on this slide, with classification systems being developed by the Net Zero Investment Framework, the Climate Bonds Initiative, G-Funds, and the Sustainable Market Initiative's Asset Manager and Asset Owner Task Force, just to cite a few. While no consensus exists across all these classification systems, they all integrate projected, current, and past emissions alignment, as well as criteria relating to the quality of transition plans, and differentiates between assets that can be considered as already net zero, assets that are demonstrating alignment to low carbon pathways, and assets that are committed to aligning. Increasingly, we see the idea that the composition of portfolios should change through time, with more focus on transitioning assets in the short term, gradually shifting to assets that have already achieved their net zero level as 2050 approaches. This means that we need to classify financial assets into different alignment categories. So we see emerging a new question relating to alignment assessment methodologies. Can the result of alignment assessment methodologies be used as data input to classify assets into the different alignment categories highlighted by these frameworks? Well, the answer is it depends. It depends on the type of the alignment assessment. We are seeing an increasing number of alignment assessment methodologies integrating multiple criteria relating to a financial assets transition plan and journey, and resulting in maturity-dependent output that can be used to classify these assets into different alignment categories, at least in theory. This is the case, for example, with the ASCOR methodology for sovereigns, of the Transition Pathway Initiative assessments for corporates, as well as certain proprietary methodologies distributed by private vendors. But other alignment assessments are not framed using the idea of categories of alignment and need a bit more work to inform the classification of assets in categories such as net zero, aligned, or aligning. Their outputs can be difficult to interpret as such, as a range of elements are summarized into a unique proprietary alignment indicator, and their effect on the final result cannot be disentangled. This is the case with most implied temperature rise core metrics. Yet, we are seeing some changes recently, with vendors starting to distribute multiple datasets, focusing on different angles, such as past alignment, current alignment, and targets alignment. As a conclusion, now that we untangled the multiple strings of the alignment spool, the question is whether this vast range of methodologies at different levels and used for different purposes can be used to meaningfully assess the alignment of a group of financial institutions, so going one level up. Our preliminary research showed that there are potentially three conceptual avenues to do so. The first one is what we call the financial market coverage approach, that is counting the number of financial institutions that achieve a certain rating or scoring in an FI level transition plan alignment assessment methodologies, or FIs that are signatories of net zero initiatives, for example. This is the approach taken of most net zero initiatives progress report. We find it is a good first step, but we would like to go further in the CAPA project. The second type of approach is what we call the financial flow alignment approach, that is identifying in the aggregate which financial flows are directed to assets considered aligned, aligning, net zero. This means that we need to use one or several approaches to classify assets and then map financial flows. Finally, the third potential avenue is what we call emissions alignment approaches, that is aggregating the emissions embedded into targets at higher level to compare these with the remaining global carbon budget. This means that we need to investigate whether and how emission related to different asset classes and activities can be aggregated. We will further investigate these in the second stream of work of the CAPA project, which is just starting now. This ends our tour of the alignment assessment methodologies world. Thank you very much for listening, and we will be happy to take your questions. Thank you very much.
Since we have no questions for the moment, I suggest that we go directly to Vincent Boucher's presentation, and we will take questions afterwards. Again, everyone, you are very welcome to write your questions in the chat room. Thank you. Vincent, the floor is yours.
Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Vincent Boucher. I'm the ESG Director of Scientific Portfolio at EDHEC Venture. And I'm happy to present you a second study of this first stage of the CAPA project, which is the development of a sensitivity analysis framework. So why a sensitivity analysis framework? As discussed by Julie just before, there is an increasing number of methodologies, including methodologies for emission alignment. I think in the alignment cookbook 2, we've analyzed more than 13 of these type of methodologies. And but the problem is there is a large divergence in the results of these methodologies. I will just highlight this after. And on the same time, we've seen several studies who have done very nice work in structuring these methodologies and in identifying key design choices. Some of them have been just discussed before, but there are also other work from the portfolio alignment team or the Glasgow Financial Alliance on net zero that have done similar work. And so now what we lack is to quantify the impact of different options for each of these design choices. And that's the goal of this second study that I'm going to present. So before to dig into the model, I will just summarize a little bit what we know from the literature. So first, as discussed, and that's probably the motivation of such study, is we observe that both at company and portfolio level, implied temperature rise, so ITR, may diverge a lot. For example, in the first alignment cookbook, the authors show that the ITR of the Euronext low carbon 100 may vary between 1.5 and 3 degrees depending on methodology. So this result is hard to understand because different methodologies might have very different design choices and multiple different design choices. So the goal of a framework is to be able to identify one by one the impact of each of the design choice that we will call parameter in the next slides. Regarding other studies, two studies are quite interesting into the regards. First, Halibos and Fouet in 2022 have shown that if you just change the greenhouse gas emission scope, but you keep all the other design choice equal, the temperature, so when I say the temperature, I will just skip it for implied temperature rise, but it's always implied temperature rise, of a company may vary by more than 1.8 degrees. This is done for 3 automotive companies. And they also show that if you change the way you project greenhouse gas emissions of a company, that may impact the temperature of a company by more than 1 degree. And another study which is quite interesting for us is Franco and al. In 2023, who show that different aggregation options, so when you want to move from a temperature at company level to portfolio level, depending on how you weight this temperature, you might have a resulting temperature at portfolio level that will vary by more than 1 degree. So given this emerging literature, the goal of our study is to extend these results to other design choices, and more specifically to some of them that have been identified in the recent literature. So how did we design the model? In this slide, what I would like to emphasize is that we first listed parameters. When I say parameters and design choice will be the same, So to do so, we made a review of an analysis of existing methodologies. That was part of the presentation made by Julie. And we also reviewed other literature, including specifically a study done by the Glasgow Financial Alliance in 2022 that made suggestions regarding design choice and different options that could be tested quantitatively. So this table just summarizes all parameters on the central column and the parameters that had been identified by the Glasgow Financial Alliance. Of course, we have just added a few parameters that we thought were relevant, and I will just get into details just in the next slide. So how does the model works? Now that we have identified, so sorry, we've got all in all 15 parameters. But in this study, I will focus on results at company level. So not all parameters will be relevant. For example, aggregation parameters will not be relevant, but I will focus on the other one that makes like 11 of them. So how does the model works? First, we need data. That's always the issue with this climate alignment. You're aware of it. We need both company and scenario data. Company data, it means activity-related variables such as revenue, gross profit, production, and greenhouse gas emissions, of course, and different scope, and also targets. At the scenario level, we also need data, same type of data, but at sector and global level. Now that we have this data, we will follow the different methodological steps that have already been identified in the literature, which are first to define a benchmark. What's the benchmark? Benchmark is what the company has to do to be aligned with a given scenario. So this benchmark might be defined in terms of intensity or absolute emissions. That will depend on for example, the allocation approach. I will discuss it later. But anyway, at the end, you have to finish with an absolute emission benchmark. And then once you've this benchmark, so what the company should be targeting, you will project its activity and finally its absolute emissions. Then from these two, so in this example, for example, I made a very simple hypothesis of constant emissions. It's like the line you can see here is just the emission intensity and the absolute emissions. When you've got the benchmark and the activity, the last step will be to compute the overshoot and the ITR. So to compute the overshoot ratio, you will just take the area, the red area here. So what you think that the company will emit more than it should, the red area, and divide it by the white area, which is the carbon budget of the company. And if you want, you can translate this overshoot to an implied temperature rise using different methods, but the most famous is using a ratio that will transform an overshoot to an ITR. So here I give just an example for one company, but I will get back to this one later. So I would like just to highlight that the model has been developed to work at both company and portfolio levels, but once again, in this presentation, I will only highlight results at company level, so no aggregation. First, I will present like two, let's say, theoretical results that are not dependent on data, but are two remarks more general to the implied temperature rise methodology. The first one is the question of ITR versus overshoot. Some of you might have noticed in the previous slide that the resulting temperature rise was very low in a way. That might be surprising. It surprised us at least. And I will just explain why and why we think we recommend to focus on overshoot rather than implied temperature rise. The first thing is if you limit the horizon of study to 2050, which is usually recommended in the literature, this will tend to limit the overshoot ratio to around 100%. You can see it on the upper right figure. If you consider the red area and you divide it by the right one, the carbon budget, overshoot divided by carbon budget. Same if you consider constant emission, which is quite conservative in terms of hypothesis, you will very rarely have an overshoot more than 100%. So you might say that's maybe not an issue. An overshoot of 100% is quite a big figure. But the problem is when you translate it into implied temperature rise, if your carbon budget, your initial carbon budget, or your reference scenario, sorry, is a 1.5 scenario, which we think is relevant, this will lead to an implied temperature rise of only 1.8 degrees. So that might be surprising, but that's just to give you a figures at the global level. So the remaining carbon budget from 2020 to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees was 500 gigaton of CO2, while the similar budget for 2 degrees was 1,150. So it's like 130% overshoot. So for these reasons, but also for other related to uncertainties, we think it's just relevant to stay at the overshoot, which is quite easy to understand. Second theoretical results I would like to highlight is the question of allocation. You may have heard of different approaches to allocate the remaining carbon budget to different companies. So imagine you've got carbon budget at sector level, you want to allocate it to different companies of this sector. How do you do so? There are three main methodologies, three main approaches, which are the convergence, reduction, or fair share allocations. I won't go into details of each of them, but what I would like to highlight here is that for companies whose initial intensity is higher than the one of the sector, it will be, in a way, easier to reach their objective if they have a reduction approach. And it will be a bit harder. So as you can see on the graph, they will have to reduce their intensity faster if the approach is convergence. And finally, it will be harder if the approach is fair share. Of course, these results will reverse for companies whose carbon intensity is below the sector. So the point here is just to say that the allocation approach does not only change the result of an assessment at portfolio level, it has a huge incentive at the company level. So mostly when you use this type of assessment to maybe shareholder engagement or whatever, it's very important to understand that each of the three allocation methods will give very different incentives to the company. Okay, so that's all for the theoretical results. As you can see here, it does not depend on the data or the quality of the data or whatever. Now I will just illustrate the model with three steel companies, which are Evraz, SSAB, and Centrop. I've chosen these three companies because they have quite heterogeneous levels of intensity, whatever the metrics you consider in terms of scope, and in terms of denominator, might be production, revenue, or gross profit. And they also have different trends. So that's why I think they were relevant. So what we've done is, for these three companies, we've first, that's the left side figure, sorry. We've assessed their overshoot in what we call the reference configuration. So all the parameters are set to these values that you can see on the low left table, sorry. And so this leads to these 69, 101, and 56 overshoots for the three companies. And then one by one, we've just changed one parameter. So here I give the example for the horizon. Here we've tried to reduce the horizon to 2030 and see what happens. What happens is that the overshoot of the three companies is highly reduced, as you can see on the bottom right table. And the overshoot variation for the three companies is more than 69% on average. So this is quite a big overshoot variation, which means that the horizon parameters has a big impact. So that's how the model works. Of course, after that, we've done, and if you're interested, you can see it in the full report. We've done it for all the other parameters. And I will just present a summary of the results for all these parameters. So among the 11 parameters we've tested in this study, we show that the denominator used to normalize emission, which can be revenue, gross profit, or production, the way you project the intensity of a company, which can be like using historical trend, constant intensity, sorry, or taking into account the climate target of a company, and the horizon, so these three parameters have the highest impact on the overshoot deviation of the three steel companies. Of course, you might be, these results stand for these specific sectors and these specific companies, so they cannot apply for, cannot be generalized, but they shows that some factors, some parameters have way more impact than others on the overshoot variation, and should therefore be the focus of special intention for methodology developers and financial institution users. Okay, so key takeaways of the second analysis of the PACTA projects. So what we've done is to develop a generic implied temperature rise model with 15 design choices identified in the literature. We show that it's preferable to compare overshoot rather than implied temperature rise. We also show that for the allocation approach has different impact depending on the type of companies, and that for high intensity companies within a sector, reduction is less restrictive than convergence and than fair share approaches. We also show that for three steel companies, the parameters with the highest impact of an overshoot are the denominator used, the intensity projection, so the way you project, and the horizon. And I would like to finish by highlighting that this is the first step in this work with this model. And in the second phase of the PACTA project, the sensitivity analysis will be extended to the aggregation parameters, which is how to convert these company level results to portfolio and financial institutions level. So thanks again for your attention, and I'm happy to try to answer any question.
Thank you, Vincent. We already have a number of questions for Julie, so I propose that Julie, you answer them first, and then we'll move to your questions, Vincent. Thank you.
Great, yes, thank you. So we have a first question on the use of sectoral benchmarks by external assessors and their reliability. So, this is something, yes, that we have looked in the second alignment cookbook. As mentioned, we do a detailed review. It's more than 100 pages actually, of 50 plus different alignment assessment methodologies that apply both at the portfolio level and the corporate level. And we look in detail at how they are built and what kind of assumptions they rely on. And we look in detail, for example, at what type of scenarios and pathways they use, and also whether they make use of sectoral decarbonization pathways. And so what we find is that approximately half of the methodologies reviewed rely on IPCC scenarios, and another half rely on IEA scenarios, with an increasing number relying on the net zero emissions 2050 IEA scenario. What we also find is that a lot of these methodologies often rely on multiple scenarios depending on the sector. So for heterogeneous sectors where no specific sector specific pathways exist, these methodologies will usually use IPCC scenarios and a global sector agnostic decarbonization pathway to build the alignment assessment. Whereas for what we call homogeneous sectors, so sectors with clear units of production, so the utility sector with kilowatt-hour, or the steel sector with tons of steel manufactured, for example, will use sector-specific decarbonization pathways taken from other scenarios. And here, most of the time, it will be from IEA scenarios. We also find a certain number of methodologies that rely on their own pathways, so that build proprietary models in order to extend the number of sector-specific pathways available, and sometimes geography-specific pathways. And we also find a number of methodologies increasingly using other scenarios, such as the NGFS scenarios. We've actually found 5 methodologies relying on these, and the Transition Pathway Initiative pathways as well. In terms of research on this in this area and which scenarios are useful or not, I would recommend the very good work of the OECD on this topic that was published last year or a couple of years ago, if I'm not mistaken, on the use of scenarios in portfolio emissions alignment assessment methodologies. So this was the question on scenario. We then had a question on whether trying to build an aggregated metric, a consolidated assessment of a group of financial institutions was relevant, because it would take away the focus to ensure that the actual micro-level flows and engagement are incentivized towards the right technologies and sectors. I agree fully with this comment, and this is one of the challenges of the CAPA project. We do not want to build a consolidated alignment assessment approach just for the sake of it. And this is why we find that it needs to contain more than just emissions metric. It needs also to contain financial flows alignment metric that is identifying whether financial institutions are effectively reorienting their financial flows towards assets that can be considered climate solutions, net zero aligning and the like. But as I said previously, the challenge is that there are multiple frameworks and guidelines that exist and that give a list of criteria as to how to classify different assets in different buckets. And so the challenge is to basically pick and choose which approach to take to do so, because we obviously do not want to reinvent the wheel with so much work being done in this area.
Thank you, Julie. We'll come back to you, but I think we want to give the chance to Vincent to answer one of his questions. Pick up the one you want, Vincent.
Yeah, so thank you for the questions. Okay.
Your mic.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, okay, maybe there is a question regarding the implied temperature rise versus the overshoot. So yeah, the question is, you suggest that focusing on the relative carbon overshoot is easier to understand than going towards an ITR, but for a regular user, what does a 100% overshoot mean? So I'm not sure it's easier to understand, but at least it involves less uncertainties in the computation, and yeah, it makes for me more sense, and it's easier to compare, mostly if you want to compare between different methodologies. So you remove a layer of complexity in the methodology, which I think is great. What does it mean, like a 100% overshoot? It just means that compared to what the budget that the company should use to be aligned with, for example, 1.5 scenarios, you think that the company will use two times, sorry, this budget. So I think it's quite easy to understand and quite easy to compare, because you will just say that any company with an overshoot, with a positive overshoot, of course, will not be aligned. Then if you want to say which one is maybe better than another one, or how far is it from alignment, you can just look at the figure and say, for example, that 100% overshoot might be really not aligned, while a 20% overshoot might be more aligned. So I will not say that it's easier to understand, but at least it's easier to compare if different methodologies use this metric. So that would be for this question. And maybe
yeah, we have another question by Thibault on the use of scenario.
Yeah, so this question is a very good question. I didn't put it as a parameter, but that's clearly one major parameter, which is the scenario. So why did we use only one in this study? First, because that's one of the few which is are freely available, and one very important point is we had to transform a little bit the scenario, because not all the variables we need to compute the ITER do exist in the scenario. I'll just take one very quick example, but if you look at sector emissions within a scenario of the International Energy Agency, you will not have its emission for the different scopes, for example. So that means that you have to estimate these emissions on different scope for each sector, which is quite tricky. The same idea, we usually talk about metrics such as revenue or gross profit, but these metrics do not appear in the International Energy Agency at sector level. So we also have to estimate them. So that's why switching from one to another scenario, because we wanted to test all the potential combination of design choice, were quite tricky, because each scenario we have to adapt them a little bit. So that's why in this first study we analyzed only one scenario, but I completely agree that would be relevant to try with other ones.
Thank you. We'll come back to you, Vincent, with Mathieu's questions, but we want to Julie answer a few questions that she has.
Yes. So there is one question on the challenges I mentioned relating to portfolio alignment tools, saying that there is divergence across methodologies in the results. And the question says that, well, perhaps we need to compare like-for-like methodologies, that some methodologies are better designed than others, and therefore it would be interesting to compare methodologies that only follow best practice in terms of key design choices. That's a very good idea. We haven't done it. And one of the reasons why we haven't done it is because it is much harder done than said. Basically, now we are seeing in alignment in the alignment assessment methodologies that we reviewed in 2024, we've seen that a lot of the methodologies that we had reviewed in 2020 had actually evolved. And that some of their key design choices had actually changed to follow some of the, best practices identified by the portfolio alignment team and GFANS between 2020 and now. So we are seeing an increased convergence towards, implementing those best practices. Of course, it is not always done or not always possible, but at least we are seeing some changes and we are seeing some moves in that space. That being said, the devil is in the detail. I mean, there are many more design choices than the ones that we identified in the first cookbook or that the portfolio alignment team identified. And so even if we were able to let's say set aside those methodologies that follow recommendation in terms of best practices and others, and this is a big if, I think it would be very difficult already to do the separation. Doing the comparison, I think, would show us that there are still, quite a lot of divergence across the results. And this would be explained by the fact that there are more choices to be made, in the nitty-gritty of methodology design than just those big family of design choices that were identified. But I think I mean, if we were able to do it, it would be an interesting exercise at least. Then we have another question relating. So let me find it. Relating to companies that provide products and services with negative and that provide solutions basically, and that in some methodologies such as the SBTi standards are being asked to decarbonize. So the focus is on their decarbonization, and perhaps that the focus should be, at least on the short to medium run, to allow them to scale up their climate solutions, and then after a while decrease their emissions and decarbonize. So basically how to treat differently assets that can be seen as providing climate solutions, whether assets whose challenge is to effectively decarbonize because they operate in very carbon intensive sectors. And the question was whether some frameworks exist that are able to take into account properly the financing of climate solutions. So the answer is yes, we are seeing more and more of that. For example, financing climate solutions is one of the 4 key financing strategies of GFANZ, and they've listed a number of criteria to assess climate solutions. We also find the climate solution category, let's put it that way, in CBI and in other classification frameworks. In the SBTi standard for financial institutions, the long-term net zero one, which hasn't yet been published, but whose first version was under consultation last summer, we also saw this idea of classifying assets into different alignment buckets. One of these alignment buckets being climate solutions, because financing to climate solutions need to be scaled up on the short run. So we are seeing this this idea taking more and more let's say importance in the field, and we are also seeing this in net zero target setting protocols. The NZAOA, the NZAOA and the Net Zero Investment Framework, for example, both include a climate solutions financing target in the different target types they recommend to their members to set.
Thank you, Julie. We're back to you, Vincent, with another questions.
Yes, sorry, I'm not sure which question to look at because I see a question in the chat. Yeah, okay, maybe on the chat I've seen a question regarding regarding the company's emissions. How do we project companies' emissions? Okay, so we've got at the moment 3 options. First one is to consider future company emissions as constant. That's the easiest one. That's the one that is illustrated. It's quite conservative, but it may be also a way to cap the potential overshoot. Second one is to take into account the historical trend. When you do so, there is a question of how long do you want to take into account the historical trend, because usually you don't have data for more than 10 years in maximum, but usually less. So it's hard to say I will use like a 10-year trend to project for 40 years. So usually in the model, we just took the hypothesis that because we, on the company with studies, we add 5 years data for all scopes, we project them the trend for 5 years, and then we keep like a sector trend. Then the third option, which is the one you suggest, is to use the target set by the companies. At the moment, when we use it, we make a kind of simple assumption that companies will reach a target which is the same type of target as the one developed in the model. So it does not really take into account the specificities of the target. Why? Because we wanted to do so, of course, but just looking, for example, at the science-based target initiative framework. So it might also answer another questions regarding this framework. The target set by a company will very depend on the scope, the horizon, the sector. It depends on the sector. And for a given sector, the company might choose between an absolute reduction approach, so that's, let's say, the one everyone does the same, or a convergence approach. So yeah, so it's quite hard to integrate this kind of informations. Moreover, as you suggest, it might be hard to estimate whether this target is credible or not. What you can do in this case is just to compare the current trajectory if the target has been set a couple of years before, and say, okay, if the trajectory is aligned, I can trust in the way the company. But yeah, the thing, it's also one of the limitations, in my view, of the SBTI framework is you have very, very different options, including for a company of given sectors, which make them difficult to compare and difficult to integrate in this kind of framework. So at the moment, we take a pretty easy option, sorry, for this emission projection, but that's something we could work on later.
Thank you, Vincent. You have another question from Saskia in the Q&A. Have you examined how these methodological decisions affect real-world outcomes in temperatures alignments on specific assessment of portfolio or companies?
Sorry, just read again the question.
Can you pinpoint any methodological decision that drives the biggest difference in temperature assessment? That's in the Q&A.
Okay, sorry, I switched from the chat in the Q&A. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So as we said, so first I'd like to highlight that we focus on implied temperaturized methodologies, but it's one way to compute a temperature, because we use this, let's say, overshoot methodology, where we rely on carbon budgets, the philosophy. We do it because it's the approach recommended by, for example, the portfolio alignment team. You have to be aware that there are other ways to give a portfolio height here. For example, sometimes you just say categories, like if you consider that for some qualitative reasons a company is not aligned, you will give it a score of 3 degrees, and or if it's more aligned of 2 degrees, and then you will average it at portfolio. So you will also have a height here. So I will just say first that we focus on this specific type. Then regarding your question of real world outcomes in temperature alignment, as I said during the presentation, I think the step of converting the company alignment in terms of carbon budget to an implied temperature rise that would correspond to the global economy level is quite tricky for different reasons, including the uncertainty related to first, the link between the overshoot and the implied temperature rise. You have a bunch of literature, like climate literature on this. So it might lead to very different temperature for the same overshoot. And also a problem is when you have an overshoot at the company level, at the moment what we do is we consider that the whole economy will have the same overshoot. But that could be discussed, because you could consider that for some sectors that's maybe relevant, but for other no. So at the moment, we prefer not to focus so much on this real world temperature implied temperature rise, sorry, but more on the company overshoot, which we think is enough to measure the alignment or not with a given scenario.
I think that's it for the questions. I will answer myself, and I will turn the camera to make it more visible. Maybe to answer the last one from Ladislas, and we have a few more minutes. So if you want to ask further questions on the chat or the Q&A, please do so. My name is Stéphane Voisin. I'm coordinating this research project at the EDHEC and PARC Foundation. Quickly, yes, we had basically a dialogue with almost all the providers of frameworks methods that are mapped in this alignment cookbook 2. Note that we are actually planning to expand our existing ESG database cartography that you can find on our website, which is a global one, to include alignment framework and methods mapping into an interactive web platform to make sure that all parameters can be updated and will not be obsolete. So we will do that at some stage to make sure that basically Cookbook is updated not in real time, but at least on a decent timing. I don't want to speak for SBTI. I don't think they pretend to be the only science-based method in the marketplace. We clearly show that they're not the only one. Mathieu earlier has proposed and has presented the ACT development, which is also very interesting. We see different very interesting tool in the marketplace, and it's developing very quickly. If we do a Cookbook 3, probably in 2 years' time, there will be over 100 methods. By then, obviously, the regulator will have potentially also try to control or to introduce some minimum requirement that will probably reduce the spectrum of on the distribution of methods. Let's see. But I really want to take this conclusion words. There are no other questions. First of all, to thank you all for attending this webinar. To thank again our sponsors, ADEME and ClimAct Arc, who recently joined the project, and we are very happy to have them on board together with their ecosystem. This is an open project, so if you own a method or tool that you believe that is missing in this report, please reach to us, contact us, and we will make sure to include it. If we think that we've made a mistake, we will take that into consideration. More importantly, if you think you can contribute one way or the other to the next part of the project, next phase of the project, which already started. We had a few weeks ago a very interesting workshop on aggregation and consolidation. We will have a further one in June. If you want to participate into that, please reach to us, and we'll be very happy to include you in this workshop. So we're moving on to this phase. You will find now in the chat a link towards a survey that we put together on aggregation and consolidation issues. Please upload it and return it to us with your views, your experience on aggregation. This is an important matter, we believe, and we want to dig more into that. And the phase after that will be on gap reporting, and we think that will be useful to that. So we will come back to you in the course of the autumn, so certainly, and probably again in the next winter. Thank you all for your participation. Thank you for the speakers, Peter, Mathieu, Julie, Vincent, and see you soon. Bye-bye.